You think a dusty war medal makes you untouchable, Grandpa? That's what Officer Merrick said, before slamming a 76-year-old black man against the pavement and snapping his cane in half like he was breaking a stick of firewood. No weapon, no threat, no crime, just a military jacket and a spine that refused to bend. That was all it took. But what Merrick didn't know is that the man he dragged in was not just a veteran. He was Echo One, a man whose decisions once redirected U.S. military policy in the Middle East. The man who trained the very agencies now watching his arrest unfold on live feeds. If that man can be cuffed like a common criminal, what does that say about the country he once risked his life for? And where you live? Would someone speak up? Or just pull out a phone? This isn't just a story about abuse. It's about what happens when silence fights back. The midday sun beat down on Willow Ridge Commons like a silent verdict. No one spoke, but everyone could feel something about to erupt. Though there were no alarms, no blood spilled. Only an elderly black man stood alone at the crosswalk, an old military jacket draped loosely over one shoulder, and a pair of worn-out boots carrying the footprints of generations long forgotten. Raymond Elias Ford, 76, didn't hurry, nor did he lower his head. He crossed the street as if time itself had finally run out of ways to slow him down. Every step was a defiance. Every tap of his wooden cane on the concrete was a reminder. He had survived things most people wouldn't dare to look in the eye. From the corner, a patrol car from the Briar Glen Municipal Precinct screeched to a halt, blocking his path like it was stopping a bank robbery. The driver stepped out without needing an introduction. Everyone in the town center knew that swagger, that look constantly scanning for something to dominate. Officer Declan Merrick, 43, white, smug, and long overdue for a lesson in humility. "Hey, old man," Merrick barked, his voice cutting through the air like a hammer, even though no one asked him to speak. "That outfit got you thinking you're still a hero?" A few heads turned on nearby benches. A few coffee cups were gripped a little tighter. No one intervened. No one quite knew what to do when dignity was insulted without leaving a visible wound. Mr. Ford stopped. His gaze didn't flinch. "You done, son?" It was a simple reply, quiet, unprovocative, but to Merrick it was the wrong answer. The kind he liked to call non-compliance. Merrick stepped forward and twisted Mr. Ford's arm behind his back like he was apprehending an armed suspect. A pop cracked from his shoulder, and a split second later, the cold snap of handcuffs echoed. Mr. Ford didn't cry out. Blood began to drip from his wrist, but his face remained calm. His cane, the same one that had walked beside him from Fallujah to Hellman Ridge, was stomped under Merrick's boot. A sharp crack rang out as half the cane skittered into the gutter like a broken spine tossed aside. Someone gasped. "Why are you arresting him?" "For walking." Merrick didn't answer. He drew his foot back like he just stomped out a parasite from a machine he served. "Resist, and you'll hit the pavement," he growled. Then, before the stunned silence could settle, a voice rang out across the plaza, shaky but fierce. "He saved my son in Iraq." An elderly woman, silver-haired and tear-eyed, clutched her purse like it held the last piece of something sacred. "Step aside, ma'am. You're obstructing law enforcement." Merrick snapped, reaching for his taser, his glare threatening to erase an entire generation's memory. In the crowd, a young officer in a crisp uniform, badge still gleaming, stepped back uncertainly. "Sir, maybe we should take a moment. Say another word and you'll be writing parking tickets till retirement." Merrick cut him off. No one intervened, but someone had already pulled out their phone. And in exactly 16 seconds, just 16 seconds, the world witnessed not an arrest, but a legacy trampled in broad daylight. A broken cane, a drop of red, and the unwavering eyes of a man who never needed to shout to force others into silence. That was the moment a nation began to listen, not because of a raised voice, but because of a silence that could not be broken. And it was only the beginning. When the final steel door of the Briar Glen Municipal Precinct clanged shut behind him, no one in the holding cell realized who they had just locked up. Raymond Elias Ford, veteran, once the strategic advisor behind Operation Thornvale, a top-secret mission that redrew the geopolitical boundaries of the Middle East, now sat quietly on a cold wooden bench, as if nothing had just happened. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask why he was arrested. He didn't protest. He simply rested two calloused hands on his knees, eyes calmly lowered to the rough concrete floor. No one knew that behind that silence, something was already moving, not in a military sense, but in a moral one. Lieutenant Nolan Keene, a young officer fresh out of the Federal Internal Affairs Academy, stood watching through the holding cell window. He had witnessed the entire arrest in the plaza. And what chilled him wasn't Merrick's behavior. It was the eyes of Mr. Ford. Eyes that held no fear, no resentment. Only the calm of someone who had once stood amid mortar fire and still knew exactly where he stood in history. "Who is that man?" he asked the colleague beside him, a jaded desk officer sipping weak black coffee. "Just some stubborn old man causing a scene. Probably drunk." The guy shrugged, not bothering to check the file. Merrick logged him for obstructing an officer. Keene said nothing, but something didn't sit right. His instincts, honed during a year-long tour in Fallujah, told him this wasn't just a routine disturbance. The way Mr. Ford held his spine upright, never furrowed his brow despite the restraints. The way he looked at the world like he'd seen it a century before anyone else. Keene returned to the control room and pulled up the federal facial recognition system. One quick scan. No matches. But just as the system closed, another window blinked open. Protocol Sentinel, Tier K. A classified interface Keene had never seen. Flashing red text filled the screen. Restricted identity match detected. Clearance Sigma, 1 required. He froze. Seconds later, a silent cascade of alerts spread from the Ironwell Federal Complex, the headquarters of the Federal Integrity Division, FID. On 3 isolated servers, a synchronized warning lit up. Possible breach in legacy cover protocols. Echo 1 tag active. Echo 1. That codename had surfaced once during a training briefing Keene only heard about through a leak. A man who led missions so deep that even future presidents were denied access to the files. A man who had once ordered 17 U.S. soldiers spared during the Helmand Ridge campaign after his superiors had written them off. A man whose profile, every time, ended with a single phrase. He's not in the system, because he is the system. And now, that man was sitting in a basement holding cell like some forgotten old stranger locked up by mistake. And while someone was typing up the arrest report, on the other side of the country, the ethical architecture that Ford once built began to tremble. Not to save him, but to answer a humiliation the system had never seen before. In every data center, in every hard drive that once buried forgotten truths, a silent note file quietly activated. If Echo 1 is compromised, the system will remember. Mr. Ford didn't know, or perhaps he knew better than anyone, that his silence was no longer just personal. It had become the first knock on a door long sealed shut by collective indifference. And once that door opened, Briar Glen would never be the same town again. That evening, as a light rain began to fall over Briar Glen, the first drops didn't come from the sky. They came from fingertips touching phone screens. A 16-second clip, filmed on an old Samsung phone by a student named Micah Templeton, was uploaded to a TikTok account called @ Justice for Echo. The video opened with the crack of a cane being snapped underfoot and ended with Raymond Elias Ford, handcuffed, seated on the pavement, fine rain misting his worn military jacket. No effects, no music, just one caption. "This is how we treat our heroes now." Within 45 minutes, the clip had surpassed 250,000 views. By midnight, the hashtags #RangerDown and #HonorBroken were trending, not just on Twitter, but across Truth Social and Threads. Veterans, and those with fathers or grandfathers who had once worn the uniform, began sharing the clip like a quiet confession. Not for Ford, but for themselves. One user commented, "My grandfather used to tell me about a guy in his unit named Echo 1. Saved the whole platoon in Helmand. I just saw him." But the post that turned the incident from outrage into a federal shockwave came from a place no one expected. An anonymous account named at flux_override17 with an IP address traced back to the Ironwell Federal Complex, the top-secret data nexus of the Federal Integrity Division. The post contained only one sentence. Echo 1 is not forgotten. The silence is over. And below it, an encrypted excerpt from a redacted tactical file from Operation Thornvale, stamped in crimson. Eyes only, Tier Sigma, 1, Echo 1 clearance required. Twitter held its breath. Reddit exploded. The FBI panicked. Meanwhile, in a small apartment on the south side of Havenport, freelance journalist Dana Ellery, fired 2 years prior for investigating misconduct in the Lancaster County SWAT unit, was typing her first article in nearly 2 years. Her headline was simple. The old man arrested yesterday in Briar Glen may be the legendary figure erased from all records. Echo 1. Beneath the article was a side-by-side comparison. One from the TikTok video, the other a grainy 2003 photo of a never-acknowledged tactical unit. The faces were slightly different, but the eyes were identical. Eyes that feared nothing but being forgotten. What Ellery didn't know was that, just 7 minutes after publication, her article was flagged by an internal government censorship algorithm. But strangely, it wasn't removed, because the very system flagging it, Flux Signal Drive, was now under temporary override by a command code of the highest tier, Omega String 378A. The only person authorized to activate that code? Raymond Elias Ford. And as if he had planned for this moment years in advance, every corner of the moral network began to stir, not out of outrage, but from a long-standing debt still unpaid. A buried truth was rising on its own, without permission, without media, without a courtroom. All it took was one clip, and one name the entire system had tried to forget, but couldn't. The next morning, in the ground floor holding cell of the Briar Glen Municipal Precinct, Raymond Elias Ford remained seated. No sleep, no food, no words. The gash on his forehead had dried, but the bruises at his wrists were still dark red, like a reminder that some wounds don't need healing. They just need to be witnessed. Lieutenant Nolan Keene stood in the hallway corner, looking through the narrow glass window. He had never seen anyone sit upright for 12 straight hours. No slouching, no nodding off. Ford sat, as if in a formal inspection, spine straight like a seam down a dress uniform. His eyes not focused on any one person, but seemingly piercing straight through the aging brick walls of the precinct, into the conscience of everyone standing on the other side of the law. No defense offered, no questions asked. And then, outside, something no one anticipated began to unfold. At train stations in Houston, Minneapolis, and Boise, groups of veterans began to appear, without orders, without signs, without chance. They simply stood in silence, re-wearing old camo jackets, worn leather belts, and name tags of fallen comrades. On each of their chests, stitched onto a small cloth patch, Echo 1 Lives. But it was in Branson, Missouri, the former staging ground for the Thornvale Special Operations Team, that the movement reached a new height. Captain Maren Kessler, former tactical commander and now a military lawyer, stood at the West Point graduation ceremony, where she was invited to give a commencement speech and tossed away her approved script. Amid the stillness of held applause, she said just 4 sentences. I knew him. He once saved me from a wrongful execution order in Helmand. I stand here today because of a man no one dares mention. And if he's being arrested for his dignity, then I, too, ask to be arrested for mine. The clip spread online at lightning speed. Within 30 minutes, an interactive map titled Where Echo 1 Was went live, marking over 2,000 locations where people had either served with, encountered, or been saved by Raymond Ford. Each dot represented a story, and each story was a dagger in the silence of the system. But the real climax came later that day, when a young woman in Wexley Borough, Naira Elston, a sophomore majoring in tech engineering, discovered something chilling. The original 16-second video had been altered by the Flux administrative system. She recovered the raw file through an auto-backup malware routine. In the restored version, 2 extra seconds played at the end. It showed Merrick smirking, saying, "He's just another dried-up old man. Like those clowns in Fallujah. We bury guys like him every week." Those 2 seconds froze the internet. Rage was no longer symbolic. It became moral evidence. And in that rising tide of silent resistance, Ford still said nothing. Because he didn't need to. People weren't listening with their ears. They heard him through the pain they'd once been forced to swallow in silence. And this time, they weren't staying quiet. Far below Quantico, in a sub-basement most FBI agents never even knew existed, the protocol ACC, Advanced Contingency Command, began to stir. At first, it was a faint tremor within the high-level ethical alert system. But then, a cross-signal from Ironwell Complex, carrying authentication code Omega String 378, pierced straight into the central control core. 4:12 a.m. A red line of text blinked across the lead monitor of the surveillance operator. Echo 1. Identity reconfirmation triggered. Moments later, dozens of sealed files marked non-restorable archive, presidential tier only, lit up on screen. The files contained everything on Raymond Elias Ford, a man once granted top-tier override access to 6 fully read classified missions, a former strategic advisor to 3 U.S. presidents, the architect of Operation Shadow Gorge, which dismantled the entire financial web of the Black Spiral terrorist network in 2006. None of this existed in civilian databases. No valid social security number. No registered fingerprints in any law enforcement system. Because Ford was never a civilian. He was a ghost created by the government, and the last one allowed to operate beyond the law for moral reasons. The supervising officer, Marcia Quinn, immediately issued an emergency release order, a Sigma-tier directive commanding all enforcement units within a 60-mile radius to cease contact with Ford and prepare for a guarded honor evacuation. But it was too late. At Briar Glen Municipal Precinct, the situation had already spiraled. That morning, Declan Merrick filed an urgent report accusing Ford of public disturbance, non-compliance, and refusal to identify himself, a narrative carefully crafted to sound official. Relying on that false report, Lieutenant Myron Caldwell, the on-call district officer, signed off on a transfer order moving Ford to Ashgate Hold, a federal detention facility designed for high-risk detainees tied to national security concerns. Merrick hadn't signed the transfer, but his falsified report had become the lever that pushed the final wrong move. And in doing so, he unknowingly hit the only blind spot the ACC system hadn't yet patched. The transport vehicle had left the precinct 17 minutes earlier, just as the emergency directive from Quantico reached Briar Glen. God damn it, Marcia muttered, slamming her palm against the desk, tension coiled in her voice like wire ready to snap. She ordered a reboot of the auxiliary communication line and escalated the alert nationwide, under a code no one ever thought would be used again. Ranger Ascendant, priority red. The signal was immediately dispatched to cooperating agencies, DoD, NSA, Homeland, and one retired division that hadn't been activated in nearly 12 years, codename Ember Watch, the only unit ever authorized to communicate directly with Echo 1 once he was no longer within the federal chain of command. At a quiet ranch in Clearhaven County, 3 elderly veterans, silver-haired, eyes still sharp as ever, received the message via an old satellite phone. He's been touched. No one needed to say a word. The transport van carrying Ford was still winding its way through Ashfield Pines, its wheels slow but steady. But something else was moving faster, the very mechanism he had once designed. A moral network buried deep within the government. A system that reported to no superior. A system with one sole purpose. If a man like Ford was violated, then America needed to look in the mirror. And this time, there was no turning away. 8:27 a.m., a gray morning in Briar Glen. The old air conditioning unit groaned behind the police station. Officer Declan Merrick sat in his office, cold coffee at his side, eyes locked on the surveillance feed. Rumors had begun to swirl overnight, but he remained unervingly calm. He believed, like so many times before, he would walk away clean, until the door opened. 3 men stepped inside. No uniforms, no badges, no threats. The man in front, a black man with gray hair, was none other than Federal Agent Garrick Hayes from the Federal Integrity Unit, FIU. He pulled a thin leather folder from under his coat and placed it on Merrick's desk like a written death sentence. "Are you Declan Merrick?" Hayes's voice was cold, like Montana marble. Merrick raised his chin, smirking. "Sure am. What's the problem?" Hayes didn't blink. "You're under arrest. On charges of abuse of authority, obstruction of federal ethics inquiry, and triggering reverse activation of the ACC protocol." Merrick chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Funny. I thought only delusional old vets get locked up. Me? I followed protocol. You got a warrant?" Hayes said nothing. He slid the folder closer to Merrick. Inside wasn't a court summons. It was a flux audit, a detailed record of every unauthorized access Merrick had made into federal files. Every modification, every line labeling Ford as a potential threat, submitted just 10 minutes after the original video clip went viral. At the bottom of the document was a red stamp. "Override breach. Personal bias confirmed." Hayes leaned forward, eyes locked on Merrick. "You're not being arrested for a mistake. You're being arrested for contempt, dressed up as law." Outside, no one moved. Not a single officer protested. No one spoke. Some looked down at the floor. Some looked at Hayes with unreadable expressions, equal parts relief and fear. Merrick was handcuffed. This time, there were no batons, no shouting, only a heavy silence, thick as a funeral march. As he stepped out his office, a fax slid out of the admin printer, crookedly typed with a headline. "Jurisdiction transfer. Federal Integrity Unit assumes full oversight of the Echo 1 case. Effective immediately." But the story didn't end there. The media stayed quiet. No major outlets picked it up. No breaking news. No press conferences. Only a quiet notice posted on the FIU website with the opening line. "From this moment forward, the law will no longer shield contempt." At the same time, at Ashgate Hold Federal Detention Center, the transport van carrying Ford arrived at the security gate. But instead of being led to a holding cell, he was met by a man in a dark gray suit, Senior Executive Director Jonas Wexler, Special Envoy of the Federal Inspector General. Wexler didn't say much. He simply bowed his head and handed Ford a sealed envelope. Inside were just 3 lines. "We owe you an apology. The system was wrong, and your silence has awakened our conscience." No announcements, no escort, just the gates of Ashgate quietly opening, and beyond them, the beginning of a storm. Not a storm of anger, but the kind of storm justice brings when it's no longer bound. Just 36 hours after Declan Merrick was led away in cuffs from Briar Glen, the Federal Integrity Unit, FIU, officially launched a nationwide investigation under the codename Operation Delta Echo. At first, it was filed internally as a standard procedural review. But within the first tier of documentation, they uncovered 7 regions with identical patterns of misconduct, from authority structure manipulation to falsified reports, civilian record tampering, and distortion of flux access protocols. And on the map of the United States, Briar Glen didn't sit on the margins. It sat at the center. From within, layer by layer, the flux system, the government's internal ethics surveillance engine, began to leak into the light. Every deleted audio file, every clipped video, every report labeled lost due to system error, all were restored by Cipher TraceLink, a decryption tool co-designed by Raymond Elias Ford 14 years ago. And then, in the dead of night, something unexpected happened. Something that would completely shift the course of the investigation. 1:13 a.m. Ashgate Police Headquarters. A data fire was reported. The evidence storage room exploded. All surveillance cameras were disabled in just 3.2 seconds by a single attack protocol. Vanta override Ghost Path 12. No one claimed responsibility. But a clip recovered from an offline backup system showed a blurry figure. A silver-haired man in a black coat and gray cap, walking away from the scene exactly 2 minutes before the blast. He didn't look at the camera. He said nothing. But on his left arm was a faint badge. Ember Watch Ret. The government called it sabotage, but the online community called it something else. The first reckoning from within. The fever spread. Hashtags like hashtag Pattern Delta, hashtag Ashgate Burn, and especially hashtag Echo Did Not Forget flooded every platform. Civilians across the country began submitting evidence. Cases from other states suspected of resembling Briar Glen. In just 4 days, over 9,000 previously suppressed civil records were reopened. Each one carried the same haunting question. If Ford hadn't been arrested, how many more would have stayed buried? Federal agents were deployed to 7 flagged regions, now labeled Pattern Delta zones, including Elmsworth, Hollow Bend, Clear Haven, Foxmore Junction, Ridge Valley, West Pine, and the most volatile of them all, Briar Glen. And there, they uncovered a chilling pattern. The offending officers had all had their records cleaned by an independent legal advisory network based in Wexley Borough, led by a name that had never appeared in any public registry. Delphine Rook. The organization had no public presence, no website, no official personnel list. Yet it had post-clearance access to flux behind a layer of encryption only core system architects would know. And of the 3 people who ever held that level of access, only Ford was still alive. Immediately, FIU issued a special directive, ordering the reactivation of Protocol Prime Mirror, a contingency program sealed away since 2009, the year Ford stepped back from the front lines. The SIC system needs someone like Ford to expose the bleeding. But to clean it, we need him back. And as if it had all been waiting for this moment, Ford didn't decline. He simply spoke one sentence, with a voice as steady and cold as steel. Start from within. Because this time, he wasn't here to reclaim his own honor. He came to check the moral pulse of an entire nation. No grand ceremony, no brass bands, no flags flapping triumphantly in the wind. When the FIU offered to award Raymond Elias Ford the highest civil justice medal, he quietly shook his head. He hadn't returned for recognition. He didn't need a bronze statue. He didn't want a holiday named after him. What he asked for was a collective memory that refused to forget. True honor isn't in medals, Ford once told FIU Director Garrick Hayes during a private briefing at Ashgate. It's in whether you remember why I was cuffed and who clapped when it happened. After his refusal, something unexpected happened. The people, without orders, without campaigns, began sending letters to the FIU headquarters. Handwritten envelopes, sealed with old stamps. Inside were thank you notes, recollections, and even crayon drawings from children. One showed an old man with a cane and a caption in shaky letters. You're still standing, so we can stand too. In just 2 weeks, over 4,200 letters and drawings were received. A carpenter in West Pine carved a message into a piece of oak. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the final warning. That sign was later mounted outside the temporary FIU office in Clear Haven, where the Pattern Delta hearings were underway. At a high school in Ridge Valley, the principal launched an essay contest titled, When Justice Doesn't Speak in Shouts. The winning entry came from a 7th grader, just 3 simple lines. He didn't fight back. He didn't scream, but he made a whole country look in the mirror. And from these fragments, a new symbol emerged, still standing. A small black badge depicting a man standing tall with a broken cane. It wasn't made to glorify one man. It served as a reminder of a moment when one person's silence forced an entire system to expose itself. Veteran communities across the country began wearing it at reunions, beside their traditional gold stars. Some newly graduated police cadets discreetly pinned it inside their caps, as a quiet vow. Never become another Merrick. In Briar Glen, where it all began, the brick wall where Ford had once been cuffed was now covered with letters, flowers, badges, and small etched stones. No one called it a memorial, but everyone knew. It was the place where justice once fell silent, and where it began to speak again. Courtroom number 6 at Wexley Federal Court wasn't loud like the high-profile trials shown on television. No signs, no chants. No press directors reading statements from podiums. Only a deep, focused silence, as if the entire room were holding its breath, bracing for a moment everyone knew would come. But no one was eager to celebrate. Declan Merrick, former officer of Briar Glen, stood in a gray suit beneath the courtroom's arch. His face still carried the same cold stillness, but his eyes no longer dared meet anyone else's. He had lost the arrogance that once made others tremble. Over the course of the 3-day trial, there were no outbursts, no heated debates, only data, uncut video, flux evidence, and the full documentation from Operation Delta Echo, each presented like a scalpel exposing the inner workings of the system that once protected him. Raymond Elias Ford did not attend the trial. He didn't need to, because this trial was never about revenge. It was about exposing a truth buried for too long. That a system may hide a bleeding wound, but it cannot hide a moral one. The kind that splinters quietly, deep and unseen, until one man chooses silence, not as surrender, but as resistance. Judge Hollis Trent, presiding over the case, read the verdict with a voice steady as falling stone. For the charges of systemic abuse of authority, assault on an unarmed citizen, destruction of civil evidence, and obstruction of a federal ethics investigation, the defendant Declan Merrick is hereby sentenced to 8 years in federal prison without parole and stripped of all law enforcement privileges permanently. This is not punishment. It is an affirmation that those who wear the law to degrade human dignity have no place in a just society. No cheers erupted. No applause filled the courtroom. Only an old veteran, seated in the back row, gently placed a still-standing pin on his knee, then bowed his head. People often speak of justice as a sentence, a form of reckoning. But that day, it wasn't the verdict that stayed with them. It was the awakening of a paralyzed moral core. And the man who stirred it needed no grand accusation, only uncompromising silence. As Merrick was led away, he glanced back once, as if expecting someone to shout, "Stay strong," or "You were wronged." But the room remained silent, not out of contempt, but because nothing more could be said to a man who traded conscience for control. And out in the hallway, where sunlight sliced through the glass, a small plaque had been hung temporarily. Not all wounds bleed. Some are silences, forced to stay silent for far too long. After the trial, the media swarmed Briar Glen. Federal networks pitched tents. International outlets scrambled for interviews. They waited for Raymond Elias Ford to reappear, to give a speech, to say something that would represent the justice just served. But he never came. He didn't return to Washington. He didn't sit on a congressional committee, didn't sign an open letter, didn't accept a guest hosting role or an advisory position. His only response was a handwritten note, short, untitled, and signed, bearing just 4 initials at the end. TREF. I don't need to be called a hero. I don't need a title. I only need the forgotten, to no longer be forgotten, and those who once bowed their heads, to never have to bow again. The last photo ever taken of him was at a small church in Southridge, the next state over, attending the funeral of a fellow soldier he once served with in the Eastern Desert. He sat in the back pew. No uniform, no medals, just an old man in a worn shirt, resting his hand on a broken cane, the same one that had been smashed against concrete just weeks before. No one recognized him, and none needed to, because he never needed recognition to exist. He only needed the truth to stand still, exactly where it belonged. In officer training programs across the country, they began to refer to the Ford phenomenon as a case study in morality tested by silence. Not because he did something grand, but because he did nothing at all. And it was that very refusal that made the system unable to justify itself any longer. Many asked, did he ever forgive Merrick? No one knows, and no one needs the answer, because forgiveness was never the destination. Remembering, that's what he chose. At the gate of his old home in Briar Glen, someone carved a quote into the wood, taken from something he once said to a young officer. Honor is not something you're given. It's what you hold when no one is watching. And in a country where voices are too often forgotten beneath the noise of slogans, the silence of an old black man made an entire nation pause, not to applaud, but to remember that some things don't need to be returned. They only need not to be lost.